The Human Voice Project, Stories Worth Hearing. When it was Saigon, this is the director's cut, and this is episode 4, The Cost of Service. Hi, Coach Gary Micheloni here, and welcome back to the Human Voice Project, Stories Worth Hearing, because every voice has a story, and every story has a voice. And today we're going to continue our director's cut of When It Was Saigon. As we've discovered throughout this entire series, no two Vietnam stories are alike. Some recall moments of danger, others moments of triumph, and some remind us that the effects of war continue long after the fighting has ended. Today's 3 stories reflect that reality in very different ways. Also, if you haven't already received your complimentary Director's Cut Companion Guide, simply stop by thehumanvoiceproject.com. We'd love to welcome you to the Human Voice Project community. But enough about me. I've got 3 people, 3 great folks that you just have to meet. Our first story is from Mike Fairhard, a United States Army officer. In Operation Moose, he takes us inside a mission that reminds us how quickly plans can change in a combat zone and how adaptability often becomes just as important as preparation. And next, we'll meet Sally Griffis, a Gold Star wife whose husband, Captain Bill Griffis of the United States Marine Corps, was killed in action in South Vietnam in 1970. In Welcome Home, Bill, she shares a deeply personal story that reminds us the Vietnam War forever changed not only those who served, but also the families who loved them. It is one of the anthology's most moving and heartfelt chapters. Our final story comes from Fredrick L. Golladay, United States Army, 4th Infantry Division. In The Cambodia Incursion, 1970, he recounts his experiences during the 1970 operation into Cambodia, giving us a first-hand look at another of the significant campaigns of the Vietnam War. 3 stories, 3 very different perspectives. Together, they remind us that the legacy of Vietnam reaches far beyond the battlefield. And they're all stories worth hearing. We'll begin with them now. I want to thank you for joining me. Now, let's listen. I'm Coach Gary. Chapter 11, Operation Moose. Mike Fairhard, 1st Lieutenant, U.S. Army, 1st Logistics Command, SSC, TMP, Republic of Vietnam, November 1967 to November 1968. It was the winter of 1967, and I was a newly commissioned 2nd Lieutenant in the U.S. Army Transportation Corps. After completing Transportation Officer Basic the preceding winter at Fort Eustis, Virginia, I was assigned there. I spent the next 6 months there, knowing full well orders to Republic of Vietnam were forthcoming. Thinking it over, I volunteered for Jungle Warfare School in Panama to improve my chances of surviving what I knew was soon to be coming. I arrived at Cam Ranh Bay, South Vietnam, in November of 1967 with orders to report to a transportation unit, i.e. convoys. Within a couple of days, my orders were rescinded, and I was assigned to 1st Logistics Command in 3rd Corps, Saigon. Upon arrival in Saigon, an Army captain interviewed me, and after looking over my background and training, he calmly informed me that my next 12 months would be broken down between 6 months in a staff position and 6 months in the field doing convoys. Which would I prefer? Neither sounded particularly appealing, but I relented and said, "Send me where you need me, sir." I was fully expecting to be a platoon leader with the trucks. After a few moments, the captain told me that there was a need for an executive officer with a transportation motor pool in Saigon, and that I would be going there for my first 6 months. Yikes! Saigon? Millions of people? Terrorist attacks? Maybe I should have made the choice. instead of leaving it up to the captain. The order stated that I would be assigned to Saigon Support Command Transportation Motor Pool. A brief overview of the unit showed the TMP staffing was approximately 100 U.S. Army personnel and approximately 400 Vietnamese civilians employed as drivers, mechanics, office personnel, and laborers. Our rolling stock of approximately 1,500 vehicles was made up of all sorts of military and civilian vehicles and included large 52-passenger buses, pickup trucks, tractor-trailer rigs, vans, sedans, jeeps, and various other vehicles. Our mission was to provide transportation to individuals and units in country without organic transportation. Some vehicles were given out on daily trip tickets, and others on semi-permanent hand receipts. On a daily basis, we also transported several thousand Vietnamese civilians employed by the military to and from work in Long Binh, which is located about 25 miles from Saigon. Before going any further, let me give a general overview of what Saigon was like in late 1967. The U.S. military was sending thousands of troops into Vietnam in an unprecedented buildup. Combat forces were assigned to various military bases and outposts scattered throughout the country. Thousands more were assigned to units based in Saigon, which is where the problem begins. Thousands of staff and support troops were based and housed in Saigon, with a population of several million Vietnamese civilians. It was very much like being assigned to a unit stateside. You got up in the morning, went to work to your assigned unit, and when your shift was up, you were on your own until the next day. Hardly a way to maintain military discipline and conduct a war. Officers, NCOs, and enlisted men were assigned living quarters throughout the Saigon area. The assigned billets, rooms, were in military lease hotels in Saigon. There was no way for units to keep track of their personnel while they were off duty. It was impossible. This lent itself to all sorts of problems. After a while, military personnel became all too comfortable with this arrangement and began finding Vietnamese girlfriends to live with. This compounded the problem, giving GIs access to dealings on the black market, selling military supplies and equipment, and, on occasion, changing money for a huge profit. Prostitution was everywhere, from bars and saunas to young Vietnamese boys trying to sell their even younger sisters to GIs on the streets of Saigon. On payday, it was easy to tell where the prostitutes were working. There would be a line out the door and down the street as GIs lined up to take their turn. Where else can you get a haircut and a shave, a sauna, and a massage, and have a happy ending, all in one place for one low price? The housing situation, with GIs living on the economy, caused all sorts of problems. Domestic violence situations occurred on a regular basis. Girlfriends suddenly became adversaries with the threat to the GI boyfriend, cowboys, street gangs, going to get you, GI. This happened to one of my enlisted men, and several days later, a cowboy on a motorbike took a swipe at him with a knife as he walked down the street. He showed up to work the next day sporting many stitches, a large bandage on his neck, and a wound running from just below his ear to just below his chin. The doctors said it missed his jugular by mere millimeters. His request, "Sir, please assign me to our motor pool in Long Binh. I need to get out of Saigon." And then there was Operation Moose, an acronym for Move Out of Saigon Expeditiously. The military brass had come to the realization that U.S. troops in Saigon were outstaying their welcome and needed to be separated from the civilian population. In December of 1967, units began moving out of Saigon to nearby military bases, namely Long Binh and Bien Hoa. My unit, Saigon Support Command Transportation Motor Pool, had until the end of January 1968 to make the move. Our commanding officer, Major Jack Droke, was a no-nonsense career officer. This was his second tour in Vietnam, his first being as a helicopter pilot. He lost his peripheral vision in a helicopter crash and therefore was no longer flight qualified. He hoped to make lieutenant colonel before his retirement. Major Droke was assigned to the TMP just in time for Operation Moose. His efficient approach to the move made things happen very smoothly. We began moving men and equipment from our compound next to the Tan Son Nhut Air Base to Long Binh. Our new motor pool was larger and very secure within the confines of the well-guarded base. More importantly, our troops were housed in one barracks on base, well away from the temptations of Saigon, although they did occasionally sneak off base at night for a little in-country R&R. Midway into January, the move was going well, and our target date of January 31st, 1968 was rapidly approaching. We were operating out of our compound in Saigon while slowly shifting our operations to Long Binh. I was still living in Cho Lan, the Chinese district of Saigon, and splitting my time between our Saigon motor pool and our Long Binh motor pool. By the end of the month, I would be the last one from my unit to move out of Saigon and be permanently assigned to Long Binh. By January 29th, 1968, we were completely moved. Major Droke told me to remain in Saigon one more day to be sure our area was clear of equipment and supplies. He would send a driver to pick me up the next day, January 30th, 1968. The bachelor officer quarters where I lived was in Cho Lan, on Tran Hung Dao Street, a major thoroughfare in Saigon. Morning commuter traffic was insane, with the street jam-packed with taxis, cyclos, motorbikes, bicycles, buses, military vehicles, and all sorts of traffic. The sounds and smells of Saigon are with me to this day. On January 30th, my day had come. Move out of Saigon expeditiously, for me, was about to become a reality. I grabbed my duffel bag with all my possessions and stepped out of my ground floor room into a short hallway that led to the lobby and the front door. Usually, at 0600, the lobby was packed with officers waiting for their rides. The front desk was always manned by a cute Vietnamese girl who greeted everyone with a smile and a "Good morning, sir." Out front was an armed U.S. security guard behind a cement wall with shooting ports, watching the traffic go by. This morning, I realized something was different. No officers were waiting for rides. No cute girl at her desk greeting everyone. The security guard was hunkered down, looking out the shooting ports. The traffic on Tran Hung Dao was non-existent. Something was up. Another officer came into the lobby and informed me that a major offensive was underway and Saigon was under attack. The U.S. Embassy had already been hit. I realized I wouldn't be leaving Saigon that day because on January 30th, 1968, the Tet Offensive had begun, and I was stuck in Saigon. The next 4 days were a blur. My 6-story high-rise in Saigon was full of company-grade officers with the Tet Offensive raging all around. One of the senior officers in the building took charge, organizing defensive positions in the building. The lone security guard out front wasn't going to cut it. An M60 machine gun on a tripod was placed in the lobby behind sandbags, pointing toward the front door. A box of hand grenades was placed on a 4th-floor balcony. A duty roster was made up with all the officers pulling guard duty, either in the lobby or on the balcony with the grenades. At night, tracers zipping past the building were a regular occurrence. A well-organized squad could have taken our position, but at least we were doing something. I realized right away that my ride to Long Binh would not be coming right away. I worried about my status and also about the status of my men, knowing full well that Long Binh was probably being hit too. When not pulling guard duty, I spent my time on the roof of the hotel with the war raging all around. Propeller-driven planes, A-1E Sky Raiders, dropped bombs and strafed a bridge and highway about a half a mile away. A Buddhist pagoda housing guerrillas came under attack by U.S. forces, and we watched from our rooftop position about 2 blocks away. But most spectacular was the battle for the Saigon racetrack about a mile away. Helicopter gunships with miniguns strafed and shot rockets onto the racetrack day and night. I learned later that the NVA and VC had been stockpiling ammunition and supplies at the racetrack. It turned into a major battle in Saigon, and I had a front row seat. After 4 days of being stranded in Saigon, I was ready to be rescued. Late on the 4th day, a jeep pulled out front, and out jumped my company sergeant, Master Sergeant MacDonald. He was short and to the point. I'll never forget those sweet words. "Let's get the hell out of here, Lieutenant." My duffel bag was still packed, and I was in the jeep with Sergeant MacDonald in less than a minute. Our ride through the streets of Saigon to Long Bin was uneventful, and my main memory of the trip out of the city was seeing the widespread destruction that had occurred in the past 4 days. It was hard to comprehend the devastation, and it felt good to be on the move. I was the last piece of the puzzle for my unit move out of Saigon expeditiously. A couple of days late, but the mission was accomplished. Mike Fairhard lives in Morton, Washington. He graduated from Washington State University in 1966 with a Bachelor of Arts in Communication and a commission in the U.S. Army. Following his discharge in 1968, he worked in broadcasting. In 1974, he returned to his hometown of Morton, Washington, to manage his family business. During the past 45 years, he has announced his annual hometown celebration, the Morton Loggers Jubilee. Mike retired in 2010. Since his retirement, he has been a substitute teacher in the Morton School District. Mike and Cheryl Fairhard were married July 15, 1986. They have 6 adult children and 7 grandkids. Chapter 12. Welcome home, Bill. Sally Griffis, Gold Star wife, widow of Captain Bill Griffis, KIA, South Vietnam, 1970, as written by Sally Griffis. Those years were so long ago, and yet it is still like yesterday. It is fresh in the memory that won't go away, a memory to both treasure and despise. It all began for me in 1964. There was something going on called a conflict in a place I'd never heard of. I wasn't a really good student of geography. On a map, I knew where the ranch was. I knew where Ozona was. I knew where San Angelo was. And of course, Austin, Houston, Fort Worth, and Dallas, and even the tiniest town of Juneau. But I didn't know where Vietnam was and why America should care. Some things I will never truly understand. I was about to marry Bill, a Marine second lieutenant fresh out of the Naval Academy. That in itself was a trip, and it put me on one of life's greatest adventures. He wasn't a rancher, which is about the only way of life I knew. All my life had been spent on the ranch, 30 miles from the nearest town, friend, or relative. It was a real home on the range. I learned to drive when I could touch the Jeep pedals and had my license by 14, the legal driving age in Texas back then. I never knew anyone on active military duty. My uncles and a cousin served in and survived World War II, but that had all happened before I was born. The only reason I knew anything about what a war does to someone is because my cousin, who had been a gunner in the glass belly turret of a plane in the war, had shell shock. Whenever we went to the river to fish at night, they had to tie his foot to a tree so if he awoke, he wouldn't run off or fall in the river and drown. They called it shell shock, but now we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. I was to learn about that later, but at that time, life was about exciting, interesting, and fun things. My wonderful Bill held my hand and led me through the maze of a bright new world. The first stop on this journey was Quantico, Virginia, for 6 months. It was basic school. To me, Quantico seemed larger than my hometown of 4,000, but in basic school we met people from all over the United States. And then I began to hear the other wives talking about this place called Vietnam. I had seen riots on the news, and of course I didn't understand why college students, and who knows who else, were rioting in the streets and willing to die for their beliefs against our government. Looking back, oddly enough, I am reminded of a TV ad for aspirin. A peaceful scene on a front porch with music playing in the background and a trellis filled with leaves and flowers. And then the music seemed to change. Same melody, but with a definite strengthening of the bass beat and a tiny throbbing black dot enlarging and eventually blotting out the entire scene. The headache only aspirin could cure. War, however, isn't so simple or easy to cure. After basic school, we were sent to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and Bill went on a Vieques cruise to Puerto Rico. My first thought was that it sounded like fun to be able to go on a cruise. I then learned that there was more than one kind of cruise. I'm not sure how long he was gone, but it was long enough to miss him terribly. However, we were able to spend our first anniversary together, and I was pregnant. The war news was constant now and more dire. The anti-war activists kept tearing, burning, and stomping on the flag. Being on a military base, though, I felt safe. Bill then received orders to Camp Pendleton, California, and told me he knew that Vietnam would be his next assignment. And so it was. He and our friends were soon lifted and flown away. I didn't worry about him on his tour. Ignorance is bliss, as the saying goes. We wrote letters, all of which I have kept, and occasionally there was a short radio-telephone conversation. Our first daughter was born in March of 1966 while he was deployed, and thankfully we were able to meet in Hawaii when Sarah was 6 months old. But the news became worse and worse. The man Bill had wanted as the godfather of our child was killed in action. Then other close friends were wounded, but all recovered from their physical wounds. Bill returned home sometime in July of 1967, and we were off to Camp Pendleton again. I had spent a year in a civilian's reality, and it wasn't pretty. I had seen people fly into an argument at the mere mention of the war or our returning veterans. Parades for our heroes of long-past wars were cheered, but the mere mention of Vietnam brought out the jeers and hate language. Our heroes were called baby killers, booed and hissed at. What I came to learn is that our heroes were sent to fight a war with their hands tied by politicians. However, I did not understand at a deeper level any of what else was going on and became terrified for Bill. Of course, as a wife, you can't let the husband know of the fear because he had to fight the battle of his own fear and understanding of what was going on. He was braver than I. One day after the news of the death of another friend and husband, I suggested to Bill that we should increase our insurance. He picked up a 5-gallon glass water bottle and threw it at the wall, severely cutting his hand. And that's when I saw exactly how concerned he truly was about the situation. He then told me he was being transferred to Quantico again for Amphibious Warfare School, AWS. He didn't tell me until later that he would also go from that to Marine Advisory School. That is when I began to fear greatly for my Bill. The wives' grapevine had the advisory billet as a deadly one. Aside from the war news and the schools, we had a wonderful time that year. It was 1968, and I had decided to remain in Virginia when he left sometime in June or July of 1969. The day he left, we learned I was pregnant again. He was going to miss the birth of another child. Worse yet was the war news and all the body counts. He knew he was going to be in the Mekong Delta, where there were no American ground forces other than advisors to the South Vietnamese Marines. It seemed like a deadly assignment. Strangely, when I was told I was pregnant, I knew he would be killed. I'm not a morbid person, but on that I seemed to be stuck. For some reason, I knew Bill would be killed, but it would coincide with the baby's birth. And then to make it worse, I began searching the news stories and pictures looking for Bill's face even when I knew he was in a different area. Looking for Bill never went away. In 1973, when the released POWs filed out of the planes, I was glued to the TV thinking maybe, just maybe, there had been a mistake, and he was actually a prisoner. Bill was in the field more than not, so his letters would arrive in bunches. Every night I would read notes he had written to Sarah and little It. And every day I thanked God that 2 officers and a priest had not come to our door. I came to believe that not only was Bill going to be killed, but it would coincide with the baby's birth. I began to figure how long it took for my letters to reach him, and I quit writing 10 days before the baby's due date. I didn't want any returned to sender mail. And then one day, the 2 officers and a priest did come to my door at the hospital. They were the casualty assistance officers there to tell me about Bill. I watched as they entered my room, and I knew I would eventually receive the return to sender letters. Our baby was only 18 hours old when Bill was killed. Little Sarah was not quite 4 years, and their daddy, my Bill, was dead. When discharged from the hospital, I was then told that because Bill was no longer on active duty, the government insurance refused to pay the bill. I was down, but not out. Even my daddy was shocked when I told the hospital that under no uncertain terms, he was alive when I checked in, he was alive when the baby was born, and that the doctors kept me in the hospital until after the funeral. The bill disappeared, and I didn't ask Veterans Affairs about it, and neither did I pay. It was never mentioned again. I went home to Virginia. It was disappointing to see the angst over the war was more rabid than ever. I tried to be very careful what was said around little Sarah, knowing full well she could understand what was said, even though she might not understand what was behind it all. Never would I become accustomed to the anti-war activists and their thoughtless comments. I wasn't sure that I could live this life I hadn't asked for but been handed. Family and friends rushed in to meet my every need. I needed to know I could handle it. I made the decision to be on my own until I was more confident, or perhaps I would never know. I needed to be away from those who would do everything for me. Now that I'm a grandmother, I realize, too late, how painful that must have been, especially for Bill's parents. That July 4th, 1970, my brother-in-law and a friend of his took us to a celebration. It was called Honor America Day. It took place at the Reflecting Pool in Washington, D.C., and when we arrived, they smelled tear gas, so we stopped while they reconned the area for our safest bet. We had the baby and Sarah with us, so if we needed to get out in a hurry, Don was to grab the baby, his friend held Sarah, I was on my own, and we would all head for the car. It was time to leave Virginia. I felt bad that I had seen many parades through the years, but none that welcomed our Vietnam vets home. In late December, I sold a townhouse in Virginia and bought a home in Texas, deciding to move back where family and friends were standing by. I had some faith in my ability to deal with things on my own, but was glad to be near enough to ask if help was needed. The 4th of July rolled around every year, and each year the jeers seemed a bit less. One July 4th, I was at a parade in San Angelo, Texas, and the bands marched by. Troops from all the services came marching by, and suddenly a group in fatigues came around the corner, and the crowd went wild. I was overjoyed to hear shouts of, "Welcome home," and I cried like a baby. It seemed as if I could finally breathe. And through my tears, I said what I had wanted to say for all those many long years. Welcome home, Bill. Sally Griffis is a Vietnam widow. Her husband, Bill Griffis, was killed on the 24th of January, 1970. And his second daughter, Mitty, was born on the 23rd of January, just a few hours before Bill was killed. Sally earned her master's in psychology and continued some postgraduate courses and the research targeting the effects of the Vietnam War on the American widows as well as the Vietnamese widows. She wanted both sides of the story. She was fortunate to receive a grant from the William Joyner Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences, University of Boston, Massachusetts, which enabled her trips to Vietnam. In the summer of 1997, Sally and her two daughters, Sarah and Mitty, went to Vietnam and visited the site where Bill was killed. Sally returned the next year to complete her conversations with the Vietnamese widows. Sarah and Mitty are the mothers of her 5 grandchildren. Sarah has a Master of Arts in Education and Counseling, Corpus Christi A&M, and worked in what used to be called MHMR, and is now a full-time mother. Mitty, who worked as a reporter for the ABC affiliate TV station in New Orleans, wrote a TV documentary about their first trip. The Ghosts of War aired nationally to widespread acclaim, and Mitty was awarded the regional Edward R. Murrow Award for her work. In 2012, she also won Cine's Golden Eagle Award for her freelance not-for-profit documentary, Gold Star Children. It was on not-for-profit Netflix until recently and can now be seen at goldstarchildren.org. She created a nonprofit from her continuing work, targeting the families of the military and others in need. She lives in Rhode Island and continues her work and participation in many veterans activities and Gold Star endeavors. In May, Mitty will have her master's in journalism from Columbia University in New York City. Chapter 13, The Cambodia Incursion, 1970. Fredrick L. Golladay, U.S. Army, Company B, 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, Vietnam, 1969 to 1970. The birds dropped us at Plai Jarang, where there was a small air base near the border. Another mission to God knows where. We had been operating closer to An Khe recently, and in fact had been humping the boonies all over northern Central Highlands, from the ocean to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. My thickly callous feet and myalgic muscles were continuous reminders of the wear and tear being extracted upon my youthful body. We were mountain goats, no doubt about it, or, should I say, more like pack mules. Our rucks weighed 70 to 80 pounds. I humped 300 extra rounds of ammo draped Pancho Villa style, along with grenades, claymores, and, of course, the M60 machine gun, which was around 24 pounds. I hadn't been in the Pleiku area since Firebase Bass near Kontum when I was an FNG. We knew it must be something big. The choppers descended. We disembarked onto the football field of the tiny base. After our officers exchanged their formal greetings, We broke formation and were invited by the airmen to use their facilities to clean up. Only 3 were allowed to go to the barracks at one time so as not to put any unnecessary burden on our hosts. Wow, I thought with eager anticipation, a hot shower. The Air Force personnel were very hospitable and treated us as if we were heroes or something as we headed for the accommodations they offered. Those showers were awesome for ragged, weary, muddy, empty-eyed boy men who hadn't bathed or shaved for a week. "Keep up the good work," they kept saying to us. Little did they realize that we had the same admiration for them, but in a different way. I mean, in the middle of Vietnam, hot showers, full bunks with sheets, and a mess hall with cooks dressed in whites and tablecloths, TV, and stereo equipment. They were the heroes, you bet. To us, they were living on top of the world. Having had the run of the camp and taking full advantage of the amenities, we returned to our humble poncho hooches erected on the football field. We were bloated with food, clean-shaven, scrubbed, and content. A briefing was then called, and we learned why we were there. Any lightheartedness suddenly changed to solemnity as reality began to sink in when our captain announced that we were staging for an assault into Cambodia. Military intelligence had reported heavy NVA activity in the area near the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We could expect fierce resistance, and the enemy was well dug in with bunker complexes and large quantities of ammo and arms. A chill ran up my spine. I had less than a month until I returned to the States. A short timer. The end of my military obligation. A free man. My heart raced as I envisioned my death in a hot LZ. I was so damn scared. The chopper ride to the landing zone seemed exceptionally long. We were flying unusually high. I had never been at that altitude in a Huey before. We were above the clouds and my adrenaline was building. I was on the second helicopter in the assault, and as we made our descent, I could hear the Point Bird's door gunners blasting away with their M60s. The gun smoke drifted by us. Damn, better put my feet up, I thought, not relishing the idea of having my legs blown away as they dangled from the open doorway, almost touching the skid. Adrenaline pumped in anticipation of a hurried exit. Incoming rounds were zipping by my ears, cracking the quilted inner walls of the helicopter. The crack was a familiar sound. AK-47s. Get your shit together, Fred. This is it. Another hot LZ, man. The birds wouldn't land because the LZ was far too dangerous. We were forced to jump a good 8 feet to the ground as rounds relentlessly snapped at us as we landed. The deafening incoming fire was blistering. The cinders from the recently napalmed vegetation were burning through my fatigues. No choice. Keep your head down. No time to worry about a little burn. No place to take cover. Green tracers filled the air above my head like supersonic fireflies. That initial skirmish rapidly subsided, and then we settled into the task of building a small fire base. From sunup to sundown, the labor was grueling. Filling sandbags, digging large holes around the perimeter in the hard red dirt, and then lining them with heavy OD-colored bags. Work all too familiar monotony for grunts. We would soon be calling these protective bunkers home, and abodes able to accommodate 4 to 6 guys began to take shape. The sky was abuzz with helicopters bringing in 155mm howitzers, mortars, and combat engineers to clear the tree lines with detonation cord and then to string the concertina wire. This arduous activity continued for the entire week. Routine patrols were sent out, and most times the men came back with nothing more than heat exhaustion. Large caches of weapons, medical supplies, and foodstuffs were found throughout the area, with very little resistance encountered. It seemed eerily quiet except for the occasional firefight, resulting in a couple of body counts, and the crashing thunder of fire missions by the mortar teams and artillery. The heavy activity that was reported by our intelligence simply did not seem to come. So what else is new? I mumbled to myself. All we've been doing lately is playing cat and mouse with those gooks. On the 6th day, the order came down to abandon the mission, and the fire base construction was halted. This meant dismantling everything, leaving many unfinished bunkers and large gaps between those that had been completed. The subsequent day was spent undoing our accomplishments. Needless to say, I was exhausted and discouraged. Especially troubling were the words of the president that had been echoing through my brain since day one of this ordeal. While busting our asses digging in that first day, we heard on a transistor radio a news conference in which he was asked about our involvement in a Cambodian invasion. He simply answered the query by saying, "I can assure you today that there are no combat forces in Cambodia." All chit-chat abruptly halted as we looked at each other in disgust as our ears trained on that news conference. It was like salt being rubbed into our already festering psychological wounds. It felt like we did not exist in the minds of the people back home, and that few even cared. "Don't mean nothing," I muttered. "Yep, don't mean nothing," we all agreed, too exhausted to give a shit. But this time, there was no doubt in my mind that this whole domino game was based upon lies. Nightfall came quickly. I settled into my routine of unrolling my deflated air mattress and poncho liner, prepared to find peace in dreamland. I took off my boots to let my feet air out. I chose to make my bed on the ground just behind our unfinished bunker. I had been in the bush so long, living underneath 2 ponchos tied together as a shelter, and felt claustrophobic sleeping inside. Besides, bunkers were easy targets for satchel charges. I'd be better off out in the open air. I awoke and jerked to alertness. I had guard duty at 1 a.m. It seemed as if I was asleep only a minute or two. "Wake up, man," Chief whispered in his soft Native American tone, while jiggling my big toe. "Time to pull guard." I quickly rubbed the sleep from my eyes and climbed atop the bunker. I had a clear view of the guy on the position to my left and the concertina wire directly in front of me. The engineers had cleared a large open area between the wire and the tree line. I began to make myself a tin can of C-ration coffee, and as the heat tab slowly brought the water to a boil, I was suddenly snapped to attention by the sharp pop of a trip flare going off in the concertina. I raised my weapon and drew a bead, scanning, vigilant, but there was no way I could fire into the area surrounding the light. The flare had been placed too close to the other bunker. I was afraid I'd hit the guard posted there. He was right in my line of fire. "Shoot! Shoot, man! You've got movement!" I yelled. It seemed the guy had fallen asleep at his post, not an uncommon thing for wary kids to do. The flare quickly burned out, and once again, it was black silence. My intuition was sending signals that I could not dismiss. My gut wrenched with the thought that we could have sappers infiltrating, intent on destruction. Somehow, I quelled those fears and silently sipped several more cans of coffee during the rest of my 1-hour watch. The brew heightened my awareness, yet I was ready to return to my little space and get much-needed shut-eye. I proceeded to wake the next guy. "Be alert, man," I whispered as I relayed the status report. The damp ground felt especially inviting as I pulled my boots off, laid my helmet and weapon next to me, and snuggled under the poncho liner. As my body began to numb and I drifted into the safety of a dream world, I was abruptly shaken to reality by a roaring kaboom! "What the hell?" I screamed out loud as I jumped straight up, dazed, grabbing my weapon and rising to my stocking feet. The brilliant orange flash blinded me as a large artillery piece just behind my position exploded and debris rained down. The artilleryman's beer stash began tumbling out of the sky. "Golladay!" A voice boomed out of the disorienting darkness and confusion. "We're under attack. Get over to Longaborty's bunker and let them know." It was Captain Tijerina. No time to think, just react. An order is an order. Get your ass going, I thought. And without hesitation and still partially asleep, I was in my stocking feet with no helmet. I bolted off, unaware that I was about to enter a twilight zone. The gauntlet was set. The gap between the unfinished bunkers was substantial. Easily an extended 50-yard dash. Yellow-green streaks of snapping death, AK-47 and machine gun tracer rounds zipped in front of me, sounding like thousands of bullwhips randomly cracking, crisscrossing their way inches from my nose, past my ears, and between my legs as I ran, periodically pausing to kneel and fire into the no-man's land at pith-helmeted shadows. Shadows that seemed to be dancing to a metronome rhythm. The spectral glow of the parachuted flares descended around us, and muzzle flashes revealed their positions as they advanced from the tree line. They fell or took cover, I couldn't tell, as I squeezed off more rounds at each pause. No fear, only survival. Fear would come later. The red glow of outgoing fire added to the frenzied mix of luminous color spread before me, a frightening palette that had to be traversed. "Keep moving, man!" Upon reaching Longobardi's bunker, I was met by the ridicule of those men posted there. "You stupid idiot, we know we're under attack. Tell the captain that we have it under control here," they chided. Determined to keep the captain abreast, off I went, back into the fray like a bounding jackrabbit, zigzagging across the desert floor, dodging the hunter. Suddenly, in the midst of the manic confusion, my senses on high, I could smell the distinct body odor of another, an enemy sapper, right there beside me, a stunned, disoriented look on his gaunt, shadowy face. Instinctively, I raised the butt of my weapon and smashed it into his head, hitting him again, using my weapon like a baseball bat on the back of the neck. As he tumbled to the ground, I quickly placed several rounds into his lifeless body and kept moving. My training had paid off. I was lucky. Nearing our bunker, I was rattled by an abrupt, thunderous blast. A satchel charge, or perhaps an RPG, had ravaged it. The concussion blew several of the men out the back opening. Spontaneously, in order to engage more of the enemy breaching the perimeter, I dashed toward the position where the guy had fallen asleep on guard and an M60 machine gun had been set up. The unmistakable tat-tat-tat-tat of his weapon broke my concentration. He had grabbed up the gun and, as he lifted it, killed two gooks charging over the bunker, raking the weapon upward as he fired. The morning light cast serene rays upon the now calm battlefield. It was over. A patrol was sent out, and the usual body count made. 3 or more confirmed inside the perimeter, and we had no idea how many outside the wire. The NVA were notorious for carrying off their dead and wounded after battle. They left few clues, and only a few scattered pith helmets remained. Only one American KIA, an artilleryman. I returned to our bunker to find Patterson, a good friend, reclining against it. His eyes were bandaged and blood oozed from his ears from the explosion. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Yep," was his only reply. Painfully, we waited together for a dust-off, and I didn't see him again after that. By the afternoon of the 7th day, the base had been completely demolished. The only evidences of our presence there were the scars left in the red clay of the Cambodian landscape, my numb heart, and on my weary mind. Soon we boarded the helicopters to go back to the Nam. The incursion was consummated. Fredrick L. Golladay was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1968 and served as a point man, rifleman, and M16 machine gunner in Vietnam. On the 27th of July, 2017, Fred was awarded the Bronze Star Medal with V device for his action in this story. It was awarded over 4 decades after coming home from the war in Vietnam. He currently lives in Sierra Vista, Arizona.